Hey guys, Quiv the Lazy Geek here, and today we're going to talk about the last pieces of the puzzle to buying and preparing the equipment. And in the next sessions, I'll be going into actually assembling everything and making sure that everything works. So that's going to be a whole new can of worms, and I'll be sacrificing myself by starting from scratch over again just for you. And to make sure that you don't miss this, if you're not subscribed to this channel, please go ahead and subscribe. Click on the notification bell as well to make sure you don't miss that. But today we're going to talk about USB, we're going to talk about power, and we're going to talk about a control system. So everything about all of those cables dangling ungracefully from my equipment, because my own setup is not well optimized as it is right now. And we'll see what we can do to optimize it, and I'll see whether I'm too lazy to do so or not in the coming few weeks. But we covered pretty much everything. We've covered the mount, the counterweights, the tripod, the telescope, the guider. We've talked a bit about due control. So I have on top of this little guide scope here, there is a due control kind of heated band, basically, that allows the lens not to get fogged up. And we talked about so many things, but now we have to talk about how are we going to control everything like that. And I'll start with the control part, because the control part is the easiest. We know that we have a main imaging camera that is controlled by a USB, and it also needs power, 12 volt DC, but we'll look at the power later. We know that we have a filter wheel that requires USB, and it does not require external power. We know we have a focuser that requires USB, and it does not require power. The camera ideally wants USB 3. The filter wheel and the focuser, they don't really care about speed on the USB line, so USB 2 is what they work on. And we have as well the guide scope with the guide camera. And the guide camera could be USB 3, could be USB 2. This one is actually USB 3, and I'm using it as such because it's actually a fairly high resolution guide camera, and I want to minimize the download time for it. So we have several USB cables to keep into account, and it doesn't help that actually hidden from you there's a second setup that I have here with a second imaging camera and a second focuser. So that's two more USB things to take into account. Where do you connect all of those USBs? Well, you connect them to a control system. And a control system like this box here, which is really just a standard Windows PC. I have a video that you could look at on top, I should be linking to it right now, where you see my criteria for choosing an imaging PC for standard kind of PC setup. And one of my main criteria, you'll see from that video, besides like decent processor speed and ability to power it very easily, is the USB ports, the availability of USB ports. And if you have USB ports that are available, you don't need to use USB hubs, because that is one thing with astrophotography, especially for the main imaging camera. You do not want to use a USB hub. You want to connect it directly to the computer so that the camera has enough power from USB for the USB related work that it needs to do. For things like the power and also bandwidth, it's a bit weird. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. I don't know the exact reasons. I won't pretend I do. So it's something weird. Then we have the focuser and the filter wheel. The filter wheel doesn't require a lot of power. The focuser doesn't require a lot of power because it has its 12 volt that is used to move the actual motor. So for those, actually using a USB hub is fine, and in effect you can see that this camera here has a USB hub with two USB 2 ports that go to my filter wheel and my focuser. And my computer here has actually 4 USB ports, 2 USB 3 and 2 USB 2. So I have one USB 3 that goes to this camera, and then the hub from the camera goes to the focuser and the filter wheel. I have another USB 3 that goes to my guide camera, and then I have a USB 2 that also goes to the mount itself to connect to the mount for the mount driver. This is one of the cables I actually forgot to mention. The mount also needs to be controlled via USB. So we're ending up with a lot of USB cables, but it kind of seems to work, right? Well, yes, it does. And you can see I've kind of like bundled them up here into a master cable that dangles all around and then goes to the computer. It kind of works, but it is not ideal. And this is something that I am actually thinking about changing. You can see that I have like a strap here to try and keep everything together. And with those USB ports though, and the USB ports on the computer, it can work fine. But then I have the power, and the power is another can of worms. Most of my things in here are 12 volts, right? So what I could do is have, if I don't have a permanent setup, I'd simply be using a 12 volt battery, and then I use a DC splitter. It's not ideal, but in my case it works. So, you know, why not? And you can see that I actually have a 12 volt DC splitter here. Again, not the most elegant thing in the world, but it works. And you could have a 12 volt battery, you connect it to the DC splitter, then you use standard 12 volt DC cables to connect to the focuser, to the camera, to the mount, if the mount supports that type of cable, and what else? To the computer, if the computer is 12 volts, and also to the heating strip there, the heating band for dew protection. So that's a lot of things, and my particular dew band actually has a controller that's built into its DC kind of cable. So that's quite convenient. It automatically stays a certain number of degrees above ambient temperature. So with that, you know, you can think like, okay, yeah, this is enough. And you can see I've braided my power cables also in this main cable, and I try to, you know, have everything concentrated in there. There are some exceptions. My computer does not support 12 volts, so it has a separate DC power brick that is connected on the back side of my telescope. You cannot see it because it's super ugly, but I have how do you call that? A multi-plug? How do you call that? This cable is a 10 volt cable that just goes to a splitter, which then I can use standard power bricks. And this is used for my computer, and unfortunately it's also used for my mount, because my mount doesn't have this kind of DC input. The Q6R has a two-pronged kind of system that I didn't have the cable for. So, and the mount only came with a Siger socket adapter. So I actually have something super weird in that I have a power brick that converts 110 volts to 12 volt DC to a female Siger socket, and then I plug in the mount into there. It's terrible, and I really shouldn't be doing that, and I should be looking into just optimizing all of that. But this goes into telling you like, okay, what will be going into the thought process for power management and for cable management and for choosing a platform to control everything with how it will interface with power management and cable management. I'll go back to that platform in a moment, because there's a lot more available than just PCs. So now let me explain as well why I'm braiding everything as much as I can to a single cable. And the main reason is for wind. The more you have cables that dangle in the wind, the more wind can affect your equipment. And by joining everything into a single cable, that I could try actually probably to link to my mount here somehow. Or maybe to the tripod leg to make it a bit stiffer, or no, not the tripod leg, maybe the mount, to make it like dangle less in the wind. It's really to avoid the wind affecting your imaging train as much as it could. As I mentioned in the previous video, just doing that will completely mess up an exposure tapping on your mount. The wind does exactly the same. It taps on your mount, and it is overall a terrible thing you want to avoid. And So solutions that let you not have the PC like at this level or on the table, something like that, but the PC mounted on top of the telescope, for example, can be very welcome, because then you have a single power cable that goes to the PC, and then everything else goes from the PC that's on top of the telescope to all of the equipment that is that needs it, and so there's no big cable dangling like that that I have. So that's a possibility, and there are actually some specific PCs that are made for astrophotography. And if you have a PC, it's pretty good, because you can choose your imaging software. So you can choose to go with Sequence Generator Pro, you can choose to go with Voyager, you can choose to go with APT, you can choose to go with N.I.N.A. And N.I.N.A is the solution that I use, mainly because it's open source and I've been able to just code enhancements that I needed in N.I.N.A. And that way it offered me a lot of flexibility. There are other control centers. There are the ASI Air, which is a small box that has USB ports and power input, and it will control ZW ASI cameras only, and DSLRs, but no other cameras. And it will control the filter wheel from ZW. It controls also the focuser, and in the future it might have autofocus. So this is something that is currently, that is possible, like integrated solutions. And then you connect to it via Wi-Fi, and you can control it from a tablet or from an iPod or from not iPod, iPhone, or from an Android phone. And by all reports, it's extremely good, except that for me, as long as it lacks autofocus, I don't want it. I need to have autofocus. And also the fact that it sticks, it basically makes me part of the ZW ecosystem, even though all my cameras are ZW. I don't know what the future holds, so I'd like to know that I can use a QHY camera if I were to buy a QHY camera, with respects to their advantages compared to ZW, for example. There are other solutions. You could create your own little ASI Air, basically, using a Raspberry Pi microcomputer, basically, which is also in the ASI Air, actually. And then on top of that, there are things you can install that, for example, something called Astroberry that has control software for everything, which you can also use. So that's two solutions that are there already. There's another solution, which is the Primaluce, whatever the pronunciation is. Sorry, Primaluce, maybe, I don't know. Primaluce. I don't know. Someone tell me, how do you pronounce that in, I believe it's Italian. Don't murder me, please. I'm so sorry. Hopefully it's Italian. Yeah, tell me, how do I pronounce that? And they have something called the Eagle computer. And right now I think it's the Eagle 3, and it's something that can basically be mounted on top of my scope, and it does not do just computer. It also has output 12-volt ports that you can control. It has output USB ports. It can control everything, including the DC inputs to all of the equipment via that single computer. And I'm probably showing a picture of that on the YouTube video right now, and I'm putting a link in the description below. And it's something that I'm really thinking about buying, because it's an all-in-one solution that has Windows Pro operating system, so that means I can use N.I.N.A, which is what I like to use to control all of my equipment. And it has the power adapters needed. So I can have all of my cables from the top of my telescope, and that would be so awesome. I would need to find a way to just mount it properly to the top of my telescope here. So that would really be very neat, and that's something I'm considering. It is not cheap though. And there are other solutions out there. You could have still a standard mini PC that is mounted on top of something. I think there's something that's pretty popular these days is the Pegasus Power Box, I think, which is just like the Eagle PC. It has USB ports, I think, and DC ports as well. And so you can do USB control and power from that single adapter. It does not do PC, however, so you have to connect another mini PC to it, for example. So which is why for me, like something like the Eagle 3 is very attractive, because then I can control all of my equipment. So you can see there's tons of things you can look at, and tons of things that are possible to manage this horrible piece of that I have dangling from my telescope here, which I really shouldn't have, and I really should be optimizing this. So consider it. If you already have equipment, know that what I'm doing here is bad, and it can be optimized, and I should really be optimizing it with those solutions all over the place. You also have mounts, specifically like the first thing that comes into mind is the Ioptron SEM70, SEM60, SEM120, SEM40. They have USB ports, and I think maybe even DC ports that are integrated within the mount, and so you have through the mount wiring, which can be very convenient as well. So tons of stuff that are possible. And actually I'm just thinking, like, since I never used the polar scope of my EQ6R, maybe I should remove the polar scope and do through the mount wiring of my cables. Yeah, that makes sense. Maybe I should do that. Is that possible? I need to check, but you can see that some mounts provide that by default, which is very convenient. This one is like pretty low budget for its capacity and its performance, and it does not have that feature. A lot of things to take into account while you're building your setup. And yeah, this is not an ideal solution. And so you want to take into account how do you want to do your cable management properly, so it looks better than this and you don't have a whole thing that is just dangling from your telescope. And yes, so that's in terms of power management. Splitter, or power box, or Eagle computer. Control software, will it be a Windows computer? You can have also a Linux-based computer. There is a distribution, not a distribution, but a piece of software called ECOS, I think, under Linux, that can control all of your equipment if the equipment has something called N.I.N.A drivers. Same, do you want to go for the ASI Air from ZW? Do you want to go for Astroberry? Do you want to separate your PC and your power box? Do you want to have a simple splitter and PC, and if so, how are you going to organize them, etc., etc., etc. So all of this to take into account while you're choosing your equipment, or if you want to enhance the equipment that you currently have. And this is probably next on my to-do list. So if I do end up enhancing my equipment there, I'll be sure to take a video of that so you see what I'm doing. And yeah, I think that was pretty much it. I think I mentioned everything I wanted to mention. Basically, the crux of the problem is you have tons of USB equipment, tons of equipment that requires 12-volt inputs, and you have to find an elegant way to be able to take care of all of that. And if you have a permanent setup, well, you can use a power splitter, from just like your home 110-volt power, which is what I'm doing here. But if you have to go to the middle of the garden and you don't have like a long cable, or you are going on the go, you need a 12-volt battery that will, give power to everything. You need to make sure that you have a computer, like a laptop or something like that, that will go through the field. Maybe the ASI Air on Astroberry kind of base solution would work better in that case. I don't know. So tons of little considerations, and it gets more complicated if you have to actually use a hand controller to connect to your mount. So I think with this mount, if you're not using EQ Direct or EQ Mod, I'm not going to go into that right now. The old versions of that mount, you had to use the hand controllers. You had something else that was potentially dangling from your telescope. If you're using a Vixen mount, you have to use a Starbuck 10 controller, and that can be something additional that might be dangling from your mount. So many things to consider, but in the end, you have to have those cables, and you have to make sure they're not dangling too much, and that they're not, doing this, which would affect your equipment and your exposures. So I think that's pretty much it for this video. It's, a pretty simple concept, and overall, I would recommend a Windows PC, and I'd say if you're starting from scratch and budget is not a problem, if I were me, what? I am me. If I were you, I would simply take the Eagle computer. I've heard very good reports about it, or maybe a Raspberry Pi along with the Pegasus power box. But I'd probably not go just for this. Right now I have it. It works, and that's the problem. If it didn't work, I would probably try changing it, but it kind of works, so I'm too lazy to change it. So start well, and then you won't have this problem that I have of being too lazy. And yes, having this kind of power box like on top of your telescope will likely lessen the frustrations that you have when you're starting to image, and like wind related frustration. And so that's why I think in the end, in the long term, it's very important for being lazy, and which is why I want to do something like that. And with the Eagle computer, I'd have everything in one package, and that's really something I want to consider. So that's it for this video. I hope it was useful. Thank you, so much for watching as usual. If you like this video, please go down below, click on the like button. Please leave a comment down below if you have any suggestions, things I haven't mentioned, anything like that, or you know how to pronounce prima luce, I don't know, in Italian. If it's Italian, don't bash me if it isn't. I'm sorry. And yes, please also consider, if you have not subscribed yet, consider subscribing to this channel and clicking on the little sting notification bell to be notified of new videos. And that's pretty much it. So thank you so much for watching. Whenever you can, don't forget to look up at the stars, and I'll see you next time.